I have the honor of welcoming our panelists for this discussion, Mr. Jonathan Ruckert from NovaWorks Australia, Luís Rojas Gallardo, the Secretary General from the Cámara de Diputadas y Diputados de Chile, and Stephen Dwyer from the United States House of Representatives, and Victor Marcel Pinheiro from the Senado Federal of Brazil. Hola Luis, ¿cómo estás?
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Luis también. Un abrazo.
Mucho gusto. Olá, Victor, tudo bem?
Boa tarde.
Boa tarde. Hello, Steve. How are you?
Hello, Luis. How are you? Good to see you.
Great to see you too. Jonathan, you there?
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Okay, perfect, guys. Thank you so much for sticking to the end of our conference and for being here throughout our last discussions. This is one discussion that makes me very excited about bringing to a user-centered digital transformation strategy in the legislative. Basically, the panel we're going to have is going to deep dive in this topic from your unique perspective, that is bridging the technical side of a legislature and the political side of the legislature, that is a democratic institution and representative institution. Basically, I'm going to bring a few questions to you, and the first person will answer these questions, and then we'll open to all the other colleagues to make their comments as well. I am advised that this panel has interpretation to English, Spanish, and Portuguese to those colleagues that wish to use this feature and to hear our discussions. Basically, I will start from what I was saying, that the clerk's office, the secretary general's office, many different areas that act as the bridge. For example, Steve acts as the advisor and the majority leader in the US House for digital solutions as well. They have an additional responsibility to other colleagues in other areas in the legislatures, that is to bridge the parliamentary offices and the technical staff and IT departments due to their unique political sensibility to what parliamentarians and their staff consider to be a priority for the legislative digital transformation, even going as far as to the interface of solutions that would have the end use as the parliamentarian. At the same time, they have the responsibility and the ability to politically understand the moment of the institution. They also have a deep knowledge of the institutional process you are leading. With these opening remarks from my side, I'd like to bring our first question, and the first one will be for you, Victor. We have been discussing throughout the conference the impact of traditions on the modernization and the digital transformation effort, and they are inseparable from the legislative process. And sometimes they are understood as the raison d'être of the institution and its maintenance as the vital piece of the institutional identity. It doesn't mean the legislatures are averse to technology or to the digital transformation process, in our opinion, quite the opposite. But it requires the technical leadership of you guys, as well other instances interfacing on one hand with parliamentarians and on the other hand with the technical staff. Please feel free to share your thoughts on how to bring meaningful improvements for members of parliament while respecting the institution's tradition.
So I'd like to greet everyone. Thank you, Luis, for the gentle invitation on behalf of the Federal Senate of Brazil, and also on the behalf of Mr. Gustavo Saboia, our Secretary General, who could not be here, unfortunately, to an unscheduled change of agenda. It's an honor to be here and to share some thoughts on the issues of the digital transformation of parliaments. Specifically to the question, it's not always easy to explain to senior politicians, especially senators, that you have a new model of deliberation, especially in times of the pandemic and these times of the digital transformation of how we work at the National Congress, especially at the Senate. We have here developed a system that is called Senado Digital or Digital Senate. It's an app which we use together with Zoom. So when we are at the floor or in the proceedings at committees, senators have the opportunity to be here present at the floor or the committee, or use this app and also Zoom application to participate in the discussions and the voting proceedings. I think that to bridge this gap between tradition and innovation, one of the key solutions that we're trying to achieve here is to pursue equality in the debates, pursue equality in terms of participation in those sessions between senators who are here, physically present at the session, and also between senators who are remotely present our sessions. We have some rules, special rules for remote deliberation, and those rules are focused on bringing equality. It doesn't matter if the senator is here physically or remotely. We also try to bring them equally to the floor, to the committee, to give them the same amount of time to speak, to bring their proposals to the floor, and to cast their votes on what issues we are discussing. I know we have just little time, so I'll proceed my remarks.
Thank you, Vitor. Luis, Rojas, would you like to share your comments on that? Luis, pienso que está mutado.
Ahí está. ¿Ahí sí me escuchas bien?
Sí, perfectamente.
Ya, perfecto. Sí. Primero que todo, Luis, te quiero agradecer la invitación de los organizadores, no solamente en mi calidad de prosecretario general de la Cámara de Diputados de Chile, sino también en la calidad de coordinador general del grupo de funcionarios de Parlamento Abierto que organiza Parliamentary. ¿Y por qué este es un tema tremendamente importante? ¿Por qué digo no solamente los parlamentarios, sino que también los funcionarios? Porque como tú bien decías, hay muchas tradiciones que se van manteniendo de generación en generación y que obviamente quienes manejan el trabajo interno son los funcionarios, de manera tal de que este cambio cultural, este cambio hacia un nuevo sistema tecnológico, obviamente que requiere una participación relevante de los funcionarios. Como ustedes deben saber, Chile vivió una coyuntura bastante compleja, no solamente social y política, a fines del 2019, que ahora está terminando con la elaboración de una nueva Carta Fundamental, pero además se nos sumó el tema del COVID-19, de esta pandemia que lamentablemente ha provocado tantas muertes a nivel mundial. Y en la Cámara de Diputados debimos reformular completamente nuestros planes y prioridades de manera de focalizar como objetivo central el poder garantizar la continuidad de las funciones cotidianas que realizamos. ¿Cuál era la orientación principal? Garantizar la deliberación, la votación de los parlamentarios. Para muchos, y sobre todo aquellas personas mayores que no se manejaban tanto en tema tecnológico, resultaba impensado el tener participación a través de un sistema digital. Era bastante complejo para ellos. Sin embargo, como la necesidad hacia el órgano se dice habitualmente, y aquí no había otra opción, había que trabajar en el tema necesariamente. ¿Qué hicimos nosotros? La verdad es que elaboramos en un corto plazo la provisión de herramientas tecnológicas contemporáneas que permitieran un óptimo desarrollo de las sesiones del Pleno y de las comisiones en forma híbrida. Pero, ¿qué quisimos hacer? Mantener a través del sistema digital las mismas funcionalidades que tenían los parlamentarios en la sala, en el plenario. De hecho, compramos unas pantallas LED gigantes para tener en el plenario, de manera que los parlamentarios que estuviesen presentes pudieran ver la cara, la participación de los demás. Ahora, yo siempre he insistido, uno tiene en esto que valorar tremendamente la tecnología, los avances, pero no hay como el contacto persona a persona dentro de la política, sobre todo, donde hay que llegar a tantos y tantos acuerdos. Entonces, la idea nuestra fue tratar de hacer lo más parecido la presencia en sala físicamente que aquellos que estuvieran fuera. Logramos establecer que hubiese fórmulas para, a través de una plataforma virtual, que los parlamentarios pudieran ingresar los documentos, pedir la palabra, una aplicación móvil para poder votar, vale decir, y muchas de esas cosas, Luis, hoy se mantienen vigentes. La plataforma, la oficina de partes virtual sigue funcionando de manera tal de que los parlamentarios insertan los documentos que quieren, las solicitudes de comisiones especiales, las solicitudes de sesiones particulares, los oficios de fiscalización, se han ido manteniendo en esta oficina virtual. Fue un tema complejo, pero gracias al estupendo trabajo de nuestros colegas de informática y al esfuerzo tanto de los parlamentarios como de los funcionarios, nos fuimos adaptando, yo te diría, en gran forma, y pudimos llevar esta etapa de una manera bastante positiva. Y eso se ha mantenido en el tiempo. Yo creo que eso es una de las cosas positivas, que muchas de las cosas que nos llevaron a trabajar telemáticamente se han mantenido y nos van a permitir trabajar de mejor manera hacia el futuro.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Thank you, Luis, for your considerations. Jonathan, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think traditions are really important when we look at any part of a digital transformation process, and the technical side of it, and could be actually a simple solution to some of the actual tradition, some of the issues that are actually within Parliament itself. We were working with like a African nation, and one of their sort of traditions is that it's actually in their constitution that they actually have to vote with their voice. And so therefore, when we look at the tradition is actually embodied into the constitution and the standing orders and whatnot, whereas there is a technology solution for it. However, you have to be respectful and mindful of exactly what we're trying to solve as well as part of that process. And I feel that the leadership of the Secretary Generals and the clerks have got a very important part to play in that. However, there can be sometimes external influences where it is actually really hard to particularly adopt those sort of change points as well. So it's a very interesting thing around, like, how do we actually bring the meaningful improvement to members, where sometimes we actually have to change the foundational pieces first before we can actually enable that change, which is quite interesting.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Steve, I'm guessing you wanted to speak something about this.
Thank you. And thanks again, Luis, and everyone for having me here. Happy to be here. So when I've worked in digital transformation in the House of Representatives in the United States, often run into traditions, and often something that needs to, I think, sort of be overcome in order to enable the digital transformation. And I think as a whole, the institutional offices, the clerk and the other people that don't work for particular members but work for the Congress, they're very risk adverse. They strongly believe in the traditions, and I think that's healthy for a long, stable legislature. So there's certainly positives to it, but in this age of technology modernization, there's just so many things that can and should be updated, and so you need to overcome those risk adverse to change adverse, and so I think of. I find myself fortunate in a leadership office of sort of being able to highlight where I think those things, the bureaucracies might be wrong, and because I'm in a leadership office, we often get listened to by the clerk's office and the institutional offices. But because some of these things, there are good, solid traditions that are important to the institution, like you said, that are critical to the institution. I think a lot of people in the U.S. Congress would say that voting in person is, even during a pandemic, it proved to be very important, even though we unfortunately did not use an app like I hear in Brazil and Chile and elsewhere. We considered that and worked towards it, and we've used it, those things in committees and on the caucuses. But for the floor, we just sort of did proxy voting, which just let members vote for other members, sort of a workaround, non-technical solution to the same problem. But so that's a tradition that we could not overcome. But there's been plenty of other, the institutional clerks and thought there were traditions, but we were able to say, no, members actually just want to do things better using the latest technologies. For example, there was a rule only recently that every bill had to be introduced in paper in the chamber. ridiculous, you know, and we'd wanted to change that for years. And thankfully, during the pandemic, people didn't want to come into the building, and so they started allowing, you know, electronic submission of bills, which of course should have happened 10 years ago. So I think it's important to know what's a very valuable tradition versus just bureaucratic, the way things are done. And so that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Steve, so much. Actually, we touched on this topic earlier today. Kirsten Kullikson came to share their accomplishments on the e-hopper solution. So we covered this discussion earlier today, but later on our discussion, I will provoke you to share a little bit on how the democratic leadership had its own remote deliberation and not the House itself. But some of the interesting remarks I caught from your perspectives, it is there, following what Jonathan said, there is one particular legislature that right at the beginning of the pandemic said, okay, Luis, we cannot implement a remote deliberation system because the voting for certain deliberations, they have to take place in the plenary orally, and the member has to stand and to speak their vote, yay, nay. So basically they had a problem because the member could not stand on the camera. It wouldn't make sense. So they went to the root of that tradition, and they said, okay, on the 19th century, standing up to their members, to their peers, represented accountability, transparency. So a member is standing up and saying or professing his or her vote. So how can we update these traditions? How can we understand their core values and move from there to understand new processes to make the legislature continue to function properly and to serve both members of parliament, staff, and also citizens? And it's interesting that Luis also said that how members are adapting, and in fact they are using this new framework to understand how they can form their parliamentary activities. So for example, in the committees, allowing them to participate remotely when it's needed. So it's very interesting, for example, with Victor from the Senado in Brazil, right at the beginning of the pandemic, you could see one member picking up the phone without his mic on, calling someone, and another senator answering. And this is basically the replica of a senator just went to their colleagues and asking their opinion about the bill, or having the chat they usually have on the plenary floor. So based on that, I will revert back to Victor to close this first round of questions, if you like to pose any final comments on that.
Thank you, Luis. Here in Brazil, I think we had a twofold advantage when think about this digital transformation. Back in 2014, 2015, we already moved to only electronic documents here at Parliament, National Congress. So we do not use paper. Second hand, we also, senators and deputies, they cast their votes through electronic system right before the pandemic. So when the pandemic came and the need for certain remote deliberation improvements were, let's say, imposed by the situation, I'd say that not many congressmen they opposed to these changes. One of the few, I'd say, cultural or legacies of how parliaments debate issues is that the senator or deputy, he or she goes to the pulpit and makes his statement right above the others. And of course, when you're talking about a remote deliberative system, this is not possible. In the beginning, senators were a little bit uncomfortable with this system, but just like Luis said, they are getting used to it, becoming more naturally accustomed to speaking in a camera, speaking remotely. So I'd say that here in Brazil, we could more or less go through this process more smoothly, I believe, than in other countries.
Thank you, Victor, for your remarks. And I'd like to revert back to Luis now, because throughout the conference, we have been discussing with colleagues on how to improve processes at a technical level. But when it comes to interfacing solutions that will be used by members of parliament, this is a very challenging proposition, because while one member could be very well digitally literate, another member could not be and have many difficulties. So my question to you, Luís, with the comments of the colleagues, is you, as a Secretary General, how can you determine the real needs of members of parliament from different parties, from different political groups, on their necessities for them to perform their activities properly in the committees, in the floor, and all the activities pertinent to the legislative institution?
Sí, mira, Luis, la verdad es que como en toda innovación de carácter tecnológico, el usuario juega un papel fundamental, y en este caso son usuarios especiales, son usuarios que son elegidos por la ciudadanía, que son representantes, que tienen un poder y que obviamente en muchas ocasiones es más complejo poder hacerles entender acerca de la necesidad de determinadas materias. Sin embargo, el objetivo nuestro siempre fue en una etapa inicial seguir funcionando a pesar de que nosotros no estábamos autorizados y tuvimos que modificar la Constitución Política de la República para poder funcionar de manera telemática. Debemos señalar que inicialmente esto fue casi como una imposición, como que era la única manera de que podíamos sesionar y seguir avanzando en una época compleja. Ahora bien, como en todo proceso, lo ideal es hacerlo con los usuarios, es convencerlos de las ventajas, no en contra de ellos o a pesar de ellos. De manera tal de que lo que nosotros hicimos durante todo este periodo, donde necesariamente hubo que implementarlo por la pandemia, fue tratar de hacer las capacitaciones necesarias, no solamente hacia los parlamentarios, sino que también hacia el personal que trabaja con los parlamentarios, para que entendieran que era muy fácil o relativamente fácil trabajar con esto y que podía ser de la mejor manera posible para, incluso le podía facilitar el trabajo a los parlamentarios en un momento determinado cuando trabajan a mucha distancia. Pero te insisto, en nuestro país en materia de parlamento abierto, hemos ido trabajando desde hace bastante tiempo con este sistema de co-creación, con este sistema de tratar de involucrar a la sociedad civil en los reglamentos participativos, en la ley de lobby, etc. Lo mismo tratamos de replicarlo a propósito de estos temas de la necesidad de tener esta estrategia digital de manera de reeducar a los funcionarios y a los parlamentarios. Yo escuchaba muy atentamente lo que pasa en el Senado de Brasil. Nosotros también, y me tocó liderar ese tema para tratar de tener un acuerdo con el Ejecutivo, con el gobierno pasado, para poder tener que todos los oficios de fiscalización, porque la Cámara de Diputados es fundamentalmente una cámara fiscalizadora, que por fin pudiéramos eliminar el papel y todos los oficios fueran vía digital. Lo logramos hacer inicialmente a través de la Secretaría del Ministerio, Secretaría General de Gobierno. Después hicimos un convenio con las municipalidades, de manera que todo les llegara vía digital y ellos pudieran complementar y responder a través de esa vía. Hemos eliminado de gran manera el papel. Como les contaba, nosotros dentro del hemiciclo tratamos de copiar el ambiente presencial con uno digital, y eso creo yo que ha ido facilitando el trabajo de los propios parlamentarios. Te cuento que nosotros, a pesar de que ya no estamos en la etapa más compleja de la pandemia, gracias a Dios la situación ha ido mejorando, ya estamos en una cuarta dosis de vacunas, pero por ejemplo, en las comisiones nosotros seguimos autorizando a los parlamentarios a sesionar vía telemática. No es obligatorio poder participar presencialmente. Sí lo es en el Pleno, porque para eso tendríamos que modificar nuevamente la Carta Fundamental, porque la modificación que se hizo fue fundamentalmente mientras se estuviese aplicando el estado de excepción constitucional que ya terminó. De manera tal de que yo insisto en esta materia, lo relevante es capacitación, co-creación, hacer entender que esto es bueno para el Parlamento, es bueno para el parlamentario, que vas a facilitar su trabajo, no le vas a complicar la vida, le vas a entregar herramientas sencillas. Y para eso la capacitación y el que se sientan parte de este nuevo esquema me parece que es realmente fundamental, Luis.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Thank you, Luis, for your considerations. Steve, I'd like to ask for you now. you are on the third version of the watch or fourth. Please correct
Fourth.
me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you. So you have a very interesting experience because you are identifying new needs or new demands, and you are adding to the app. So how can we identify these demands in your leadership on your members?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the lead on an app in the Majority Leader Hoyer's office, which is called Dome Watch. It's 7 years old, 4 versions, major rebuilds, and it is very widely used by members of the House and staff and the public, because we made it available to the public too. Although it's really not that interesting to the public unless they really carefully follow the House floor, which of course some lobbyists and academics do, but ordinary people, it's not that interesting. But yeah, we are constantly asked for new features for, add this, add that, because we've been lucky enough to get it widely used. And so once it's widely used, and of course it's very centrally, it's entirely focused on the floor of the chamber of the House of Representatives. So we get most of our feedback in the chamber during votes. If you stand in the back of the, one thing I love to do is I stand in the back of the chamber, and you can actually see, a whole bunch of phones all using the app on the actual floor in the chamber. And because all the members know that it's the Majority Leader's office that made the app, and because the Majority Leader staff is some of the only staff allowed on the floor. Most members aren't allowed to have staff on the floor, but we have like 7 or 8 staff on the floor all the time. The members just run up to our staff and they say, hey, your app should do this, or it should do this different or something. We don't have a problem of ideas. We do have a problem, I think, to your first question, of keeping it simple because it's used by members. So every time we get these suggestions, a lot of them are just complex, and we want to keep the app simple. We want it to be as easy and intuitive as possible. We benefit our app, unlike Victor's in Brazil. Our app is just information. The members don't use it to vote. They don't use it to join meetings. It's just a one-way communication of all the information of what's going on the floor at any moment. So that makes it easier for us to keep it simple. There's no authenticated users, for example. We don't have logins or passwords. It's just that, the public can see the same information as the members, which is also, I think, a transparency win. But yeah, we try to keep it as simple and clean as possible. But there's always good ideas and exciting ideas. But when I consider ideas, I certainly always consider, what is going to not clutter the app, not make it confusing, or where we'd have to give instructions for how to use it. No, we have to keep it as simple as possible so that anyone could just download it and use it without any instruction.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Steve. Victor, I'd like to go to you. The Senate particularly has one interesting experience during the pandemic. And I believe there was a demand from senators that, for example, senators could join the session on Zoom by calling from a phone, not necessarily having internet access. So this is one minor example, but just to show how you guys have been answering for these demands of senators throughout Brazil. So my question to you is, how do you determine these needs from senators, either for remote deliberation tools or for other digital tools that they might need for drafting, for participating in the committees, for mobilizing their base on the floor? So how do you determine what is a demand from many political parties and how to guide that to the IT staff at Prodazem in the Senate?
So here in Brazil, and I was listening to Luís Rojas about the advantages of moving forward to a digitalization of Parliament. And at the beginning of the pandemic, in which we have such a big, let's say, change in how our proceedings work, we had some questioning about if parliamentarians could not be here, politicians could not be here at Congress, or if our executive could adopt unilateral legislation, emergency legislation, without the approval of our parliament. And our Supreme Court said literally, no, the executive cannot do that. Parliament must get its meetings, must make a way of passing legislation, of controlling the executive. And at the beginning, Parliament, senators and deputies were a bit insecure about how this would work. But in 1 or 2 months, they were convinced of this advantage of working like this remotely instead of us just not getting reunited physically. So responding to Luis' question and also to Stephen points here, we have this app. It's just one login to vote and to make online presence in our sessions. At the beginning, many senators, especially senators, had difficulty of making their login and their password correct. We had trainings with their staff to explain how the app worked. And in a couple of weeks, we got there. And when you're talking about, Luis, the different technologies that are being used to make senators remotely present on the floor, we have this opportunity of a phone call, of Zoom, or on the app, because Brazil is very huge, as all you guys know, and we have some difficulties when, for example, we have a senator in north area of Brazil, which you don't have good internet access. So you just have a phone to make a call, an online call, and to cast a vote on an important issue. We have this flexibility here in Brazil, and it was widely accepted, and I'd say not judicially questioned or something like that, legally questioned. And I think it's in some way a good experience, a good practice that we developed here.
Thank you so much, Victor, for your considerations. Jonathan, would you like to share your perspective on that? You are leading a company that is helping many legislatures in APAC region. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think one of the issues that we've actually been working with and found is that really about working out when we actually are trying to work out priorities for what to deliver to members, and is that actually we find that sometimes that there's a lot of political influences that are hard to manage. Is that funding for new features, say, controlled by the incumbent government. And it can also then be linked to potentially the current government priorities, which are not necessarily considering all the different and relevant stakeholders, you know, which are outside of the actual current government as well. So, you know, I think like our biggest sort of learnings, you know, is that, you know, to understand what we think are, you know, the actual members' priorities and what to actually look at for that is that really about establishing like an impartial group that can really review and work on what features are actually important to a group as a whole, and really about trying to remove any of the political motivations behind, you know, certain features which could only really benefit, say, one particular type of group.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Luis, would you like to share your final thoughts on this topic so we can close this round?
Sí, yo estaba atento a lo que decía Víctor hace algún rato y me parece que es un tema no menor. Cuando tú tienes un país tan extenso, obviamente Brasil es extensísimo comparado con Chile, pero nosotros, como decimos habitualmente, tenemos una larga y angosta faja de tierra. Entonces hay sectores en la zona sur, en Magallanes, en Coyhaique, que es muy complejo poder tener el nivel tecnológico igual de otras zonas del país. Y ese es un tema no menor para los efectos del trabajo. Y esto a propósito de lo que te decía al comienzo, Luis, del trabajo que yo hago con la red de funcionarios de Parlamento Abierto de Parliamentary, porque también hay países que tienen un desarrollo tecnológico mucho más avanzado que otros. Hay países en que el acceso a Internet, el acceso a estas nuevas tecnologías es muy escaso todavía. Entonces, insisto que esto es un proceso lento. La pandemia nos hizo apurar muchas cosas, pero obviamente tenemos que ir trabajando de acuerdo a las consideraciones que tiene cada uno de los países, las herramientas que tengan y, por supuesto, aparte de lo que implica el tratar de tener toda la infraestructura necesaria, hay que ir avanzando también en convencer que esta es una buena forma de trabajo.
Thank you, Luis. I couldn't agree more with your final remarks. On one hand, for the institution to have the capability and vision on what lies in the future, and on the other hand, the opportunities for moments to have these leaps of modernization, such as it happened in COVID-19 pandemic. So sadly, we had this pandemic in the last 2.5 years, but from a positive perspective for legislatures, it has been a period of most modernization in legislatures across the globe in different levels of digital maturity and federative levels as well, as we can see. I'd like to go to our third question here, and I would focus on you, Jonathan, for that. According to our findings at Bússola Tech, we see that technical staff and parliamentary staff, they tend to have more advanced digital skills in comparison to members of parliament per se. Although most solutions used in the interface with the legislative process have as its users the technical staff or the parliamentary staff, members of parliament are required to use some of these solutions. For instance, the remote deliberation tools, such as in Brazil and Chile, and the DomeWatch app, as Steve was just sharing with us. Please share a little bit on your experience on how to develop friendly interfaces for members to intuitively use these solutions without having to be worried about them during their parliamentary activities.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think understanding the user base is actually very important. As you sort of were saying, that there are varying levels of degrees of technical capability of members. And, you know, from our experience is that there are, you know, quite a few members, or there are members out there that want to delegate the use of any technology options to their own staff, which is quite an important aspect, especially when you look at interfaces and whatnot. So what we've found is that it's really important to get stakeholder involvement is really key to developing a successful user face for any user base. You know, constant involvement, you know, feedback and change management is really key to any successful application being used and developed as well. So, you know, one of the key areas I think that has been sort of talking about, you know, from Stephen as well today is that, you know, keep the user interface simple and easy to understand. What you can find, you know, what somebody could be found to be very intuitive may be very confusing to others as well. And so it's really about trying to find, I think, the balance between giving functionality to the end user, and especially when you're working in remote places or you're working with a large user base, that they may not have easy access to support, or they may not have easy access to, you know, to help as well. So, you know, you need to make sure that when you're designing user interfaces, you know, that you keep the language simple. You don't have ambiguous terms in there. You know, I always look at the analogy that the more buttons that they can click, you know, the more problems you could potentially introduce as well. So, you know, you try to keep the focus on the content in that sort of mode. And if you need to go to another bit of content, then you move to another bit of content. You don't try to get everything into one, you know, large page as an example. So, yeah.
Jonathan, just an FYI, I love this phrase, so I'm going to use that.
Yeah, keep it simple. That's as simple as, yeah.
Vitor, would you like to comment on that? So I remember at the very beginning of the remote deliberation, the Secretary General's office even had a help desk set up to help senators to for them to recover their account if they forgot their password. So how have you evolved on that, on the user interface, and how to make it simple for senators in Brazil?
Yeah, this service is still working. We do have a kind of help desk. It's always working during the floor reunions and the committees, and it's very important for members to have this opportunity to know that they can get help, online help, real-time help if they have any problem. One other thing that we're also doing here constantly is our staff members are always monitoring if senators or deputies who are remotely present are casting their votes. We do have a list of members remotely present, and when we get one bill or one issue open for voting, we always check if that senator who is remotely present also has cast his vote. And this is very important. If he did not, we call it, we send a message, we call his staff, and this, it's just a small nudge towards getting his participation, but it really works to be monitoring if members are casting their votes, if they are possible, if they're raising their hands, if they have some doubts during the session. We will constantly, during the sessions, monitoring this.
Thank you so much, Victor. Luis, would you like to comment on that?
Sí, a mí, yo tuve la oportunidad, a ver, ahora sí, ya. Le comentaba que nosotros padecimos cosas similares respecto de las votaciones de los parlamentarios, porque en algunas ocasiones, sobre todo en las zonas más extremas, se les cortaba el celular, teníamos una aplicación móvil, entonces se les cortaba el celular, había que intentar llamarlos a un teléfono fijo, teníamos gente permanentemente dentro de informática para tratar de contactarlo a los distintos parlamentarios. También nos faltaban algunos a los que se les perdían las claves o cambiaban el celular y la aplicación la perdían. Entonces, una serie de situaciones, pero afortunadamente incluso de repente teniendo que viajar a algunos de nuestros funcionarios a los distritos de los parlamentarios, pero claro, todas esas cosas son parte de la implementación y se fueron viviendo, y al final yo te diría que en el balance es bastante positivo. Pero la historia vivida por Brasil es muy similar a la que tuvimos que vivir nosotros en este tipo de situaciones.
Thank you so much, Luis. I'm laughing because so many stories come into memory. So it was a very challenging period of time at the very beginning of the pandemic, but it's very interesting to see how members of parliament, not only they have evolved on their digital skills. I remember in many countries, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in Chile as well, many family members from the members of parliament also helping them to understand the tool, saying, okay, if you want to join the session, you should click here. So even the family members of the parliamentarians helping them on this transition period, which was something very interesting to see. I think I recall an article from last year about the House of Lords in the UK, one of the highest average age in a parliament house in the globe. And it was a huge discussion first. So how can we turn this house that's super traditional, that has a high average age to the remote? Not only they managed to adapt, but after a while and after it was possible to return, some members didn't want to return. They want to continue remotely because they adapted so well. So this is a symptom of a very well-developed strategy for the transition. Steve, would like to comment on that as well. How are you keeping DomeWatch friendly and intuitive for US Congress members?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the app, when we design it, we certainly use the latest general design principles. Like we, just for example, we use Google material design as much as possible, just because everyone's familiar with the button sequences of Google and everything. Similarly, we use the default recommendations for Android and iOS. So the versions look different because the way the stores recommend for basic functionality like lists and scrolling and stuff like that. So, we try to keep it as simple and just like other apps as possible. But, I think the members actually, like your stories you were just telling, Luis, when we first went remote, we did go fully remote on our committee level, even if we didn't on the chamber level. And when that was up for debate of whether or not we should do that, and the common arguments were, well, members can't learn how to Zoom. They're older. They're not gonna. They're gonna make fools of themselves. That wasn't true. Like they of course, maybe a few of them needed help from their grandkids at first. but they very quickly, and now it is here to stay. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of virtual hearings on the committee level, at least for remote witnesses and stuff, that it just makes total sense to always have them in. But yeah, I think in terms of keeping things very user-friendly for members, I remember we did use a remote app. This is something you mentioned, Luis. We used it in our leadership elections. So just for Democrats, for electing our Democrats, we used a remote app because it was in the middle of the Delta COVID wave. This was before that, but okay, but in the middle of COVID. So we used that. And I remember the first app, when we're considering which app to use, they all had way too many buttons. So, you know, back to what Jonathan was saying, it's way too complicated. So we had to go back to the vendors and say, no, like, you know, they're just taking, you know, 3 votes. There should be 3 buttons. That's it. Like they're all these other things need to be removed because it's just confusing. And because they're not going to study it, they just need to look at it and know what to do. So I think just keeping it as simple as possible. One other example we did, we've used a little digital tool for our whipping. So when we say, hey, Rep Smith, you got to go talk to these 3 members if they're going to vote for the bill tomorrow. And at first we had usernames and passwords for the members, but everyone's got too many usernames and passwords. That's off. And so instead we just, you know, made it super simple, where we just sent a different link to every member that had a hash in the URL. And so that it just single click, boom, it works right on their phone, right on the floor as they're whipping members. And that's the kind of example where you just got to make it as simple as possible. And that also means you don't have to worry about, you know, security as much. If you're, you know, you gotta take security seriously, but you got to weigh the benefits of usability and security, because they do impact each other inversely.
Steve, I couldn't agree more. Even though we are returning to, in many parliaments, to in-person meetings and gatherings in legislatures, both at national and subnational level, I don't think we can put this genie back in the bottle, because many parliamentarians saw the benefits of digital capabilities during the pandemic, and they want to continue that. They don't want to revert to a pre-pandemic model, even though they are returning to in-person meetings. So I think this is a very interesting point you brought us here. Jonathan, I'd like to revert back to you for you to close this round. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think keep everything simple. Like members of Parliament, you know, and Congress, they have to consume so much information, and they have to make decisions, you know, about very complex matters. So the least we can do is provide them with simple interfaces so they can actually make those decisions in a really, you know, easy to understand format.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'd like to go to our final questions of the day. And this question, I will start with you, Steve. To better serve members of Parliament, or members of Congress in your case, in providing meaningful digital solutions might require the coordination and cooperation between multiple areas of the institution to work together, integrating different legislative systems and workflows. Yesterday, Jonathan moderated a very interesting panel discussion about the modernization and integration of legislative systems, which brought to our attention this need. It might mean changing the way things were always done in the institution. And this is a very meaningful proposition, to say the least. To the contrary, it would mean serious dysfunctions impairing the ability to provide members the best available tools. I want to understand from your perspective in the leadership of the House of Representatives in the US, what are your thoughts on how to mobilize different technical areas of the institutions towards this goal?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've had success personally from being a leadership staffer. In my experience, I've been on the House of Representatives for many years. Not many leadership staffers care about digital transformation of the institution. They're mostly focused on, you know, important normal leadership roles, like counting votes and passing the next bill and working on the next bill. And but I have found success that you know, it's actually a political success for my boss to be seen as caring about the institution and modernizing the institution. technology wise too, to be, techie and savvy. That's good politics, because he is only a leader because he gets the votes of the members of the Democratic Party in my instance. But so I think it's, I would encourage other leadership staffers that there is a real political gain, and it's not your typical political gain where you're fighting over the same issues over and over again. It really is improving the institution in a non-political way, but you can get the benefit politically from caring about these issues, because unfortunately they're not prioritized enough, I believe. So I think that's an important thing. And then also just creating structure, I think, specifically for digital transformation. So I think in the Congress, we were very lucky that only 2 years before the pandemic, we created a special select committee on modernization, we called it. Now they've been very successful. They've been around for 4 years now. Unfortunately, I think they're going to sunset at the end of this Congress because they're sort of a temporary, like, jumpstart, modernize everything. But they focused on everything from payroll systems and HR and pay. They finally got our staff pay up, which is very, it had been flatlined for a long, long time. But they focused on technology a lot, and so there was just lots of areas of technology that should have been digitally transformed and hadn't been, not because there weren't technical solutions, but just because there wasn't enough focus and energy put towards it. So to have an actual committee dedicated to this has been great for the United States Congress. And it's led to a whole sorts of things. Like now we have a new digital service, which is in the House of Representatives, which is just a group of in-house coders and designers that are just upgrading things left and right. And lots of other accomplishments that wouldn't have been possible without the Modernization Committee. So.
Absolutely, and to be honest, I followed the U.S. Modernization Committee. I watched their hearings, and I found it to be very interesting. And if I'm not mistaken, the U.S. House also has a digital task force, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
That's right, digital task force that I've been a member of for a number of years, along with Kirsten Gullickson and others. Kirsten's now leading the task force and doing a great job at it. That's a way, thank you for reminding me of that. That is a great way to bring together all the different silos, because you got the leadership offices, you got the clerk, you got the individual, you got the committees. For us, we have the Library of Congress who run a lot of the big public websites, but you don't have anyone sort of standing above all of them, organizing them. And so that's where the task force, we have a digital task force that each of those organizations can send somebody. Not all of them do, but most of them do. And we just meet regularly and we talk about how we can work together more for the common good. And so that's been very helpful.
Thank you, Steve. Jonathan, from a person working from the outside of the legislature, how do you take these challenges to mobilize different technical areas for the digital transformation of the institution?
It's really interesting. Yeah, I always sort of come back down to, better transparency of government means, better decisions for everyone's, sake as well. So when you look at, different systems or different silos of information, there's a lot of waste, and there's a lot of areas which, that somebody has this bit of information over here, but it's not necessarily willing to share over here. And, obviously there's political motivation sometimes around that. But, what we find though is that when people do cooperate and when people do talk and, you have that sort of, consensus view, and there's sort of, like Stephen was saying, like a digital group where you make decisions as a whole, it does actually lead to a more efficient government. It does lead to more efficient processes, and it's a win-win for everyone. And even a non-parliamentarian, like, as an external citizen, it's better, from a transparency and overall point of view, that that your money or your taxes are actually, being spent in a very good manner to make a better decision for everyone else's outcome as well. So I think, by not changing, you're going to be causing more issues in the long run, in the long term. So I think, it's really important that you do get that sort of bipartisan approach to a lot of this sort of change.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your intake. Victor, would you like to comment on that?
I think here we have a bigger issue of modernizing parliaments in general, and not just for members. We've been struggling to not just to do the same things in a new way, but to do new things. And when I say that, we're thinking about becoming more transparent, having more public, social participation. We have different areas of Congress which are working together. We do not have a task force or working group, but we do, in general, work together. And we are trying to mobilize different sectors, different actors that participate in the legislative process to enhance the opportunity to lower the costs in order for them to be here. For example, we have public hearings. Nowadays, it's very common that you have a public hearing with all the participants remotely talking. You do not need to have them coming here to Brazil or capital. You make the invitations. Our staff from the secretary, they call persons, send invitations, give them the links, and then participate. We have, I'd say, a very successful e-democracy program in which millions of people every month give their opinions, share their thoughts on our bills and the bills that are being discussed by Parliament. And we're trying to integrate these thoughts and these comments on the procedure, making some briefs, some tendencies to share with members for them to bring to the floor or to an audience. So we're trying to integrate different areas of the Senate in order to enhance, make our legislative procedure, our activities more transparent and more open to society in general.
Thank you so much, Victor, for your considerations. Luís, Rojas, would you like to share your thoughts about this?
Sí, solamente dame un segundo para dos ideas respecto a la pregunta anterior. Porque es fundamental y lo vinculamos con esto, porque cuando uno quiere hacer todo esto más amable, primero es fundamental dar una solución que sea superior al escenario actual, o sea, principalmente en términos de eficiencia y calidad del proceso, más fácil, más rápido, más fácil consulta, etc. Y además, respecto del uso de la solución, toda solución desarrollada, especialmente las utilizadas por los parlamentarios, deben ser lo más sencillas e intuitivas posible, evitando la saturación de funcionalidades o también de la información en todo nivel y guiar hacia el objetivo esperado. Y eso es muy importante a propósito de lo que viene en esta última pregunta. Víctor decía algo que es muy importante. Esta digitalización nos ha permitido también hacer más democrático el estudio de los proyectos de ley, el trabajo en general del Parlamento, porque muchas veces cuando tú invitabas a alguien, tenías que hacerlo necesariamente de la capital o de las zonas más cercanas, sin la participación de académicos, docentes, especialistas de otras partes del país, que eso es realmente fundamental para ir avanzando. Ahora bien, respecto de las diferentes áreas, yo creo que en este contexto hay que dejar de lado el paradigma tradicional de la automatización de tareas, porque ya no es importante enfocarse en un exclusivo departamento tratando de buscar mejoras a nivel individual. Una gestión de innovaciones basada en los procesos es clave, de manera tal de que los procesos deben ser considerados de inicio a fin como un todo que produce un determinado valor. Y en consecuencia, como bien referencia a la pregunta, se exige un esfuerzo extra de movilización en las distintas áreas e incluso muchas veces en nuestros casos por actores externos, por ejemplo el poder ejecutivo que participa habitualmente con el Parlamento. Para lograr este objetivo es fundamental que durante las labores de estudio de una potencial innovación es la inclusión de cada una de las áreas técnicas. Es fundamental que todos participen, se realimenten estas soluciones con las distintas áreas de nuestro trabajo. Y el paso siguiente tiene que ver con ser atractivos para cada una de las áreas, que todos tienen, lo sabemos, formas distintas de trabajar. La consistencia en relación a lo que ya han estado acostumbrados es fundamental, es decir, de manera adicional a la producción global de valor esperada, debe ser beneficioso para cada uno de los actores por separado y lograr con ello una involucración mayor en todo este trabajo. Yo te diría que esta interacción ha implicado por sí sola un desarrollo de aplicaciones cada vez más inteligentes, integradas de inicio a fin, donde, por ejemplo, cada uno de los actores recibe en tiempo real notificaciones en las distintas etapas, tiene acceso inmediato a todos los documentos que forman parte de la realización del proceso y puede seguir o gestionar a una gran velocidad todos estos objetivos. La inclusión de los involucrados finalmente en estos cambios, por ejemplo, nosotros, la Fiscalía, los comités parlamentarios, las distintas autoridades, ha sido cada vez más frecuente, pues es un aspecto fundamental en cualquier innovación y entrega a todos los actores los márgenes de acción a la futura implementación. De hecho, nosotros tenemos todas las semanas una reunión de los comités parlamentarios, una reunión que persigue establecer las tablas de la semana siguiente, ver cuáles son los problemas que se están dotando a nivel de los distintos sectores del Parlamento, y eso ya los hemos ido haciendo de manera telemática, de manera que no es obligatorio que un día viernes obligues a todos los jefes de los comités a estar presentes por lo menos en el Parlamento, como funciona en Chile, en una ciudad distinta a la de la capital, en la ciudad de Valparaíso, en este caso, Luis.
Thank you so much, Luis. I think you touch in one point very precisely when you say the different areas they have to be motivated to perform this change. I would say I would go further and say that they have to be motivated enough for them to waive some processes they might have on their workflow in the name of modernizing the institution per se. So there are many cases where we see, okay, this particular area is doing this process for decades and they are not going to change. But how can we show them that a minor change in their process could mean a very profound change for the institution as a whole, not only for other colleagues in other technical areas, but for members of parliament, for citizens as well. So I would point that this is one of the most important things, in my opinion, that is, how can we waive some of our traditions and workflows that on our daily lives working in parliaments to win a more modern and digital ready institution? And from there, I'd like to ask Steve to close this last round. After that, I will provide a few moments for all of you to share your final thoughts and close the debate. Steve, would you like to close this round with your comments?
Sure. And I would just like to point out one good motivator, as you were just saying, to motivate all the different entities that need to make the modernization. One of the best motivators I found is international examples. And so conferences like this, which I have been fortunate enough to participate in a few of these now, but and I know some of my colleagues have, but most of the people in the US Congress, when I tell them about these international parliament support groups and conferences, you know, they've never heard of them and they've never considered what's going on in other legislatures. And so, for example, when COVID hit and we were strongly considering all the different measures we might take in the US Congress, we did an enormous amount of rapid research and to see what all of the rest of the parliaments in the world were doing. And so Victor, Brazil was in lots of our memos to all of our leaders saying, you know, look, Brazil's doing it, why can't we? You know, those of us that were arguing for more digital tools and apps. But so I would just like to say that, you know, the international community is invaluable, and every time I'm in a panel like one of these, I get reinvigorated and motivated myself to work more in these areas.
Thank you so much, Steve. Sadly, we are reaching the end of our debate today. I do apologize for we are a little bit over time, but I will provide each one of you to share your final remarks or final thoughts in just a couple of minutes. And Victor, I'd like to start with you. Any final thoughts for this debate?
I'd like to thank you, Luís, and the organization for this conference. And just some small thoughts. about maybe the next steps of this transformation. I think we have twofold the transformation on the side of members, and for at least for us here in Brazil, making these applications more friendly and with more broad applications. We are trying to develop here a system in which members can sign documents electronically when you have to propose a bill. In Brazil, at least, when you're trying to propose a constitutional amendment, you have to have some members support the bill. So we could have a list of proposals in our app, and members could just click or sign the bill electronically. This is one of the directions we're moving in right now. And the other direction, is just like I said a moment ago, about making our process more transparent, more participative. And this is right now a challenge for us, but we're making studies on how to bring people inside Parliament with these digital instruments. So I'd like to thank you, all of you, and I'm curious to see how we develop these next steps in Brazil and all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Obrigado por sua participação. Luís Rojas, would you like to share your final thoughts for our debate and for our conference today?
Gracias, Luis. Primero que todo, agradecer la invitación. Yo creo que esto es muy importante, no solamente para nuestro país, Brasil o nuestros otros colegas, porque a veces tenemos la fortuna de tener procesos más avanzados que otros países. Y yo lo decía hace algún rato a propósito de la integración de los funcionarios de Parliamentary que me toca coordinar. Todo esto que ustedes saben es muy importante poder compartirlo con ellos también, así que yo me llevo cosas realmente importantes de lo que he visto en el día de hoy. A ver, algunas reflexiones finales. Bueno, yo creo que las antiguas concepciones de las tecnologías de la información como sinónimo de automatización o de herramienta que cumplen funciones aisladas ha quedado atrás. La propia contingencia nos ha impuesto como exigencia el ser parte de un proceso de modernización continua que tiene a la tecnología como protagonista. La modernización obligada de la que hemos visto expuesto durante los últimos años, también junto con generarnos dificultades, nos ha favorecido la denominada resiliencia organizacional, que esa es una de las características claves en toda organización contemporánea y un activo intangible que en nuestro caso particular nos dota de seguridad y confianza para afrontar el futuro. Ahora, en el contexto de las soluciones digitales propiamente tal, cada una de las iniciativas de modernización debe ser evaluada con una perspectiva amplia e integradora. Esto de manera de permitir que se incorpore a todos los actores que son parte del proceso y sacar el máximo provecho a la solución. Toda modernización, además, debe ser integral y debe considerar el contexto, lo decía al comienzo, en el cual se desenvuelve, teniendo como principal consecuencia en el ámbito de las soluciones digitales un foco importante sobre el usuario. Usuario funcionario, usuario parlamentario, usuario país en un momento determinado, que permita no solo hacer frente, sino que además aprovechar la cultura parlamentaria. Un abrazo para todos y muchas gracias por haberme invitado a participar con ustedes. Te reitero que he aprendido muchísimo y esto hacia el futuro también sirve para todos nuestros países.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Thank you for your participation. It was a pleasure to welcome you and the colleagues of Chile as well. Jonathan, would you like to share your final thoughts?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel, and I appreciate everyone's insight and the other fellow panelists as well. It's been very insightful for me and understanding where the challenges lie and how they've sort of been able to tackle some of the challenges which we've been debating about today as well. Transformation of member services is, I think, really, really fundamental to driving a digital parliament going forward. And, as I said, members of parliament have to consume a lot of information. And, they're the ones who are doing the voting on the bills at the end of the day. So the more simpler that we can make their decision-making processes, and by, providing the best services to them, the better outcome it is going to be for the whole country, as an example. So I think, by by creating these types of applications and also learning from other parliaments and learning from other congresses around the world around what they're doing, I think, you know, the world's looking in a better place.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your final remarks and for participating. Steve, would you like to share your final thoughts?
Yeah, just that we're, thank you again for hosting me, and very nice to meet all of you fellow panelists. It's been an honor. You know, I think we're in a very interesting time where, coming out of the global pandemic, which of course was horrible for so many reasons, but for modernization, it was quite the igniter. And I think it's an exciting time for all of us to keep that going, because of course it will. We're not gonna revert to pre-pandemic times. We're gonna hopefully keep up the pace of innovation even post-pandemic. So I'm excited all that I've learned today, and to especially, you know, when Victor talked about the 2 points, you know, the second point being we focus so much internally on modernizing our institutions internally, which, you know, when we move those online, it certainly is easier to make them visible to the public, which is great for transparency and good for good government. But it's not necessarily engaging with the public in such a meaningful way. It's just showing them, which is important. But so I'm excited in the future to work more on actually engaging with the public in a meaningful way, not just letting them comment. You know, we've got lots of public comments on social media and through official channels. We've got tons and millions of comments. But to better structure that in a more meaningful way, I think is some of the future uses, which of course is only possible when the institution is digitalized to begin with. But then you can do more cool, interesting things like interacting with the public. So I look forward to that. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, all the colleagues here, Jonathan, Luís, Rojas, Victor, and Steve as well. It was a pleasure hosting you.